Welcome to the 13th episode of Peter York's Culture Wars House Party. I'm Peter York, and my podcast is about culture wars, the way modern politics is so often played out with symbols and scapegoats, with lying and astroturf organisations, instead of the real things and the big debates. I'll be talking to the players and the commentators in these culture wars and getting them to explain what they think is really happening in the world. We'll have some fun and some gossip, and we might even ask some vital questions, like who makes the best suede loafers in Jermyn Street. Sir Martin Sorrell created the world's leading advertising, marketing, communications, whatever you call it, group from 1987 on. And he started with a marvellously named holdco group called WPP, Wire and Plastic Products. And from that, he launched a series of wildly audacious takeovers of huge, long-established advertising agencies based in the American heartland of the business, Madison Avenue, New York, the former world of Mad Men. WPP bought great old J. Walter Thompson in 1987, Ogilvy and Mather in 1989, and Young and Rubicam in 2000, and countless other advertising, marketing, PR and research companies, that sort of thing. In the 33 years he was CEO of the business. When he left in 2018, it was the world sector leader operating pretty much wherever there was a market. It slipped somewhat since then to, depending who you read, the positions are different, but to fourth position with the French-owned Publicis Group leading the pack now. Back then, in the 80s and 90s, it was a golden age of agency growth and celebrity, and advertising land had a culture very much interwoven with film and TV talent. British advertising was an iconic sector, and Martin Sorrell was at the very top of it. And further than advertising, he spoke for British creative industries in general everywhere. He was the go-to guy to talk about the economy for the Today programme, things like that. By the time he left WPP in 2018 and went on to found his current company, S4 Capital, the business model of advertising agencies and the legacy, quotes, media of print and broadcasting had been pretty much broken by the internet. And when Sir Martin started talking about S4 Capital, he talked entirely in the language of the new digital world. Sir Martin is on platforms everywhere again now, explaining how AI is creating a new industrial revolution. Unlike, say, the Saatchi brothers, for whom he worked as CFO from 1975 to 1986, he doesn't talk that much about politics or culture, the arts, or the key parts, interestingly, of the way the Saatchis made their corporate brand. Good morning, Sir Martin.
Good morning, Pete. That was a very good summary, except I think we are on the edge of a new golden age, or you wouldn't think of it from the profit warning this morning from WPP. So it's quite an interesting morning to be doing this podcast with you, Peter, with WPP being even more crippled.
In what sense are we poised at the beginning of a new golden age?
Well, it's a new age. The uncomfortable thing for the industry is like the growth of data, when the Don Draper-like figures who look back to the days of Ogilvy and Raymond Rubicam and Stanley Reeser and others, and Jeremy Bullmore and Stephen King, for example. They look back to those years.
Well, I can remember the last two, yes.
They look back and they think data was going to destroy it. They think that technology is going to destroy it. And it's far from it. Data provides better insights for acute creative ingenuity, and technology aids creativity as well. It's a tool to even greater creative heights. So I think this is a new golden age, but it's different. And you referred to a traditional media industry. I mean, the whole industry, digital and traditional, is about $1 trillion. About $300 billion is traditional. It's going backwards by 5 to 15%, depending on whether, if you're a free-to-air broadcaster, you have live sport or not. The other 700 billion is digital, and it's growing at 10 or 15%. It's dominated by Google, it's dominated by Meta and Amazon, and by TikTok or ByteDance, and by Alibaba and Tencent. So you've got 3 Western and 3 predominantly Eastern platforms. But those 6 platforms account for well over half of that $1 trillion, and 5/7 at least, maybe more, maybe 6/7 of the digital piece. So it's a very different industry to the days that you were pointing out when I was at Sarch as a CFO, or when we started WPP in 1985, 86.
Now, some people might see the prospects in some ways as less than golden. The fact that the dominant entities in new media, huge and hugely controlling, and hugely controlled what one might think in the future, I'll come back to that, are businesses that take their role and their responsibilities quite differently. Businesses which sometimes won't acknowledge that they are, in any sense, media platforms, and therefore, in any sense, responsible for what occurs on their platforms.
Look, that may be true because the scale may be slightly different. But, we did have press barons and press lords that had enormous sway and Beaverbrook, Harmsworth, Murdoch, whatever, that had huge influence and sway over public opinion through the properties that they controlled, whether they were free-to-air television, ABC or CBS or NBC, or whether they were newspaper groups and press groups. They had huge influence. Now, I acknowledge that the companies you're referring to, the 6 that I mentioned, are basically nation states.
Yeah.
I mean, these companies have market caps of 3 trillion, and if you equate market cap to GDP, you could say that an Nvidia at 3 trillion or a Microsoft at 3 trillion is almost as big as Germany. Germany's GDP is about 3.5 trillion. And then you have to go up to Japan at about 5, and then you jump up to China at 18 and America at 28, and the world's 106, to give you rough ideas of magnitude. So these are bigger companies. And you're right, Peter, that the 6 that I mentioned, plus Nvidia, plus Microsoft, plus Apple, plus probably, let's just say, Adobe, Oracle, and Salesforce for matters of conversation, those companies who are spending between them well over $500 billion a year on building out AI capacity will probably continue to be dominant forces, and they will be dominant at a scale that probably we haven't seen before. But it's the same thing in many respects. These companies have huge influence. The capex that they're spending, that $500 billion a year, which the MAG 7 or MAGA 7 that we refer to them at under Trump 2.0, that MAGA 7 is spending about $500 billion a year and reinforcing its position and building capital expenditure and capacity around AI. So it's likely, in my view, that they maintain their dominance, whatever the regulator tries to do, whether the regulator is located in Brussels, in London, in Washington, D.C., or wherever. The regulator will never move quickly enough, I think, to understand and work with these companies or even work against them. So building a regulatory position that makes sense is quite difficult. But essentially, I don't think it's that much different. We've always had very, very powerful media forces that have shaped, or you could claim to shape, public opinion, where strong individuals have had immense power through editorial contact or influence to shape what was going on politically and culturally.
Beaverbrooks said back in the day that he ran his newspapers entirely for political propaganda purposes. At least you knew who he was and where he was, and if you wanted to march up Fleet Street, you could. It's rather more difficult.
No, it's just you can get to Sunda, you can get to Andy Jassy, you can get to Mark Zuckerberg. I mean, they often appear in front of congressional hearings. They're often contacted and lambasted, and people seek to influence them, Jeff Bezos and others. I suppose you could nip across to Venice as a guest and you could bend his ear. But no, I disagree with that. They are more organizational. They are often second generation. Andy Sundar are it's not Larry and Sergey. It's not even Eric Schmidt. I mean, these are generational changes, but you can reach these people. They're not, you can't say that they're faceless companies or corporations or organizations you can't reach.
But their political positions are very interesting, and you saw that at the inauguration. They were in a pen of great...
Hold on a second. What's really interesting...
nabobs.
Is when Beaverbrook, had a position, Murdoch has had a position, Hearst would have had a position historically. I mean, all these press barons and media people, you knew where they stood politically. What's very interesting about this new age is that they have flipped or changed as they sought to navigate what was going on politically. So with Trump 2.0, you saw, for example, what you referred to at the inauguration, but you also saw these companies taking positions on issues, for example, DE&I, a much less prominent position on that, because they saw the way that the political wind was blowing, at least for 4 years. May carry on for a lot longer.
Well, it has been fascinating to watch quite a lot of corporate America, but particularly the Silicon Valley super big guys, divest themselves of a lot of greenwash, whitewash, pride wash at the pressure from Trump's government.
Well, except this, what's really interesting, Musk invested and then divested, or seems to be divesting currently. And, that's overnight. We saw him having a contretemps with one of his biggest advocates the Webb Bush analyst, Dan Ives, over his criticism of Musk in relation to his political position, its impact on Tesla. So you've got a Silicon Valley entrepreneur who, in a way, thinks he is even beyond that. The power of his political principles has overcome his desire to curry favor with the administration. We saw him get involved with the Trump administration to lead the Doge effort and then depart from it. And now he's on the sidelines criticizing heavily, threatening to form a new political party, a third party, which might cause President Trump difficulty in relation. We'll have to see how that pans out in relation to the Republican Party. President Trump has already put out a tweet on Truth Social, a truth on Truth Social. He's already said that a third party helps him, but we'll see. We'll see how that pans out. But interestingly, here's a Silicon Valley entrepreneur that almost thinks he's above it.
Yes, in another world. It seems like, in the case of Musk, a world of his own.
Well, this is the contest between the richest man on the planet versus the most powerful man on the planet.
Yes. And for the moment, it's fascinating to see that rather like, nobles with Louis XIV or oligarchs with Putin, they have bent the knee politically in return for who knows what concessions.
Well, that is a real issue. I remember that one of the first executive orders that Trump signed, and it didn't get much ink. I did see Joe Kiernan and Andrew Ross Sorkin debate it for about 2 or 3 minutes on CNBC Squawk Box on the morning that he signed. But it was very early on. It was in the first week. And it was an executive order saying that it was okay to bribe government officials. That although it's still, I think, a part of the listing requirements of the SEC and SEC regulations that you can't, and that it's a felony or it's a crime, what the executive order said, we won't prosecute you if you do. So it's whose bribe is bigger. My bribe is bigger than your bribe, basically. And when I saw that, I was somewhat flummoxed by that, because was this open season? And I wondered why it was being put in place. Who was it who proposed it, why was it being proposed, but it wasn't much commented on, actually, and it wasn't picked up by the media or the analysts that much. But that was a sort of signal flag as to what this administration would countenance or wouldn't countenance. And I thought that was very interesting. And a lot of the people on the left wing or in the Democratic Party forecast that if President Trump was to be less successful in the midterms, that, let's say, lose the House, that we would start to see a lot of stories, maybe even in impeachment proceedings, in relation to some of these issues around corruption that people say are there. So look, whatever is happening, I think it is true to say that this is a very different regime to any that we've experienced before, except maybe with the exception of Trump 1.0, which was not dissimilar, but this is on steroids. I mean, and some of the Supreme Court decisions, there was one last night, which went in Trump's favor in relation to removing the blocks on reducing employment in a number of government agencies. It's going to be very interesting to see how it pans out after the midterms. My own view, for what it's worth, and this is based on some of the stuff I heard at the Cannes Advertising Festival from the media who were there, and that we spent a fair bit of time, was that the midterm polling may be a little bit better for President Trump than people think it's going to be, and he may be more successful than some Democrats are suggesting he might not be. So we'll have to see how that pans out. But, even if he loses the House, he's going to continue to issue executive orders and rely on the Supreme Court or the justices to reinforce the measures that he is taking. So that's one thing. The second thing is this the beginning of a Trump dynasty? Are we going to see Trump's sons, Don Jr., for example, run afterwards? Or are we going to see Trump run as a vice presidential nominee to a J.D. Vance presidency? I think that's more unlikely. Will Ivanka run? I think she's extremely competent, and a number of people are saying that she might go for some senatorial or congressional post in Florida and use that as a platform for further presidential ambitions. I don't think that's unrealistic. So we may be witnessing, just as we've seen with Bush and the Kennedys, a Trump dynasty or a line of thinking around American politics that will continue for more time than we thought. We had the 4-year Biden break, and it may be that we'll have Trump in some way, shape or form, philosophically or family-wise, in place for considerable periods of time. And that's something to think about, because America is a very different place today than it was under Biden, Obama or Clinton.
The Economist does a democracy index.
Yeah.
That shows that the world is moving from democracy to authoritarianism generally.
Right.
And what it says, what it last said about the US was that it was a flawed democracy. And last week I heard the editor of The Economist speak and asked her what that report would look like early next year when they report on this year of Trump administration part 2. And what she said in her very clever and careful way was sort of that it might look a bit worse.
Well, a bit less democratic is what you're saying.
A bit less democratic, yes.
There was a bad judgment as to whether it was worse or better. Some people would say that's better.
Peter Thiel would say that was better.
Absolutely. And there would be others that were supporting to look. Whatever's happening, Peter, I think there are two things going on. One is globalization or internationalization, however you want to put it. One is the bucket of geography, and one is the bucket of technology. And when I was at Saatchi's, it was the era of globalization. The thesis that I always revert to in conversations like this was Ted Levitt's article in the Harvard Business Review in 1983, where he basically postulated that the consumers were going to consume everything in the same way everywhere. And we did a reprise of his article in 2003 at Harvard Business School with John Quelch, who was the marketing professor there, 20 years on after the article. And Ted was still alive then, and sadly he died of cancer shortly afterwards. But he did say he over-egged the article to make the pudding. And what he was trying to say was that consumer tastes were going to converge, and over time, that was a very powerful influence. And that drove the growth of Saatchi's, the growth of WPP, certainly up until the late 1990s, when the second bucket started to take over, the rise of the internet, then the smartphone, now AI, in the metaverse, blockchain, quantum computing in the future. All these things are going to be the primary driver. And geographically, we're seeing fragmentation. So if you said to me, how do I see things at the moment from my vantage point, if I do have a vantage point, I would see two things. And it relates back to what you said about The Economist and what's happening in the US. The world is going to grow less fast, rather than growing more than 3%, which it did in the sort of Reagan, Thatcher globalization era. It's going to be sub 3%. Inflation is stickier than people and central bankers would wish. And therefore, interest rates are going to be higher than we've been used to and will remain higher than we probably would want. In that environment, two things are happening. One is we are seeing fragmentation, whether it's because of wealth inequality, concern about immigration, concern about the economy, whether it's due to tariffs or not having tariffs. Whatever the reason is, we're going to see fragmentation increasingly. And in that slow growth environment, our clients are going to look for growth much more carefully than they have done before. And they're going to pick out parts of the world that are growing, and they will not ignore, but they will be less excited about the parts they don't know. So what parts of the world do I think are going to be the growth drivers? North America, I think, will still be strong. It's a $28 trillion economy out of 106 and will remain super strong for a significant period of time, even if their growth rates slow over time. So that's number one. Number two, I'm very bullish on South America. I'm bullish on Mexico. I'm bullish on Colombia, on Brazil and Argentina. Maybe not so much other countries on the continent, but the nature of the population, their creativity, their technological acuity and drive and knowledge. And despite left-wing administrations like Petru in Colombia, or Obrador, or Scheinbaum now in Mexico. Milei obviously is a different force in Argentina. Lula v. Bolsonaro, and if Bolsonaro doesn't come back, somebody, in his guise, despite all the political ramifications and the volatility in the region, I think that's a growth area. I think the Middle East, again, despite the pressures that we're seeing in Saudi now, maybe less so in the UAE, but in the region, that's still a growth driver, and Asia as a whole. And a qualifier on Asia, if you're big in China, big being defined, if China is 18 trillion out of 106 and you're a global company, you should have about 15 to 20% of your sales in China. If you have more than that, maybe the Taiwan risk, and I don't think China will invade Taiwan. I think they'll squeeze Taiwan increasingly over time, and therefore there is a risk. But if you're big in China, you stay big, but you don't get bigger, and you go for India, you go for Indonesia, you go for Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia. So Asia. Africa is very volatile, too many conflicts, and likely to remain so. And Europe is slow growth. No client that I talk to or have talked to really sees Europe as a growth opportunity, despite the fact that as a whole, Europe is 18 trillion out of that 106, and therefore big, but it's multiple countries. And with the exception of Germany, where we're seeing fiscal sort of reflation because of defense spending primarily, but also because their debt to GDP ratio is only about 65%. It's not over 100% like it is in the UK or in France. They have more fiscal headroom. Maybe Germany will be slightly different, but Europe as a whole is, I think, going to be in the doldrums, and therefore that's not going to be growth. Now, the second factor is in markets like Europe, which are slower growth, and worldwide, where growth is going to be slower, as I tried to suggest before, technology is going to be super important. So coming back to where do I see the golden age in advertising, I see huge opportunities to apply technology at scale to the markets of Europe and globally in order to improve efficiency and effectiveness of what we do in advertising and marketing. A lot of the money is still wasted. A lot of the money is ill-researched in terms of inputs and outputs. And there's a huge opportunity to reduce the frictions that there are in the industry in order to deal with it. There are huge opportunities for our industry in those growth regions I mentioned, and there are huge opportunities to apply technology across the board. It's going to be different. It's going to be less labor intensive. The outputs are going to be used by humans even more effectively, but it's going to be a much more effective and efficient machine than it was before.
What about the interaction between these new technologies, these developments, etc., and culture and politics? Because you could say that in terms of certain cultural things, that Trump and the Trump people were taking America back to the early 1960s. In other words, were seeking to undo the various changes, social changes, that had taken place. And we all know what they were. They meant civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, all the way through. If you take those things back, do they have not just a cultural impact, but an impact on the dynamism and growth prospects of a country eventually?
Well, look, Trump is capitalizing on the problems that are being created by the growth. I mean, Ray Dalio, I'm not a great fan of his prose, but his charts are superb. And I remember, years ago, and I think he actually put out a lot of the stuff, it continues to do, puts out a lot of stuff on TikTok, funnily enough, has wonderful graphs to show the growth in inequality that has taken place in the world since those Thatcher, Reagan years, those golden years in the 80s and the 90s, and the divergence, capital as a proportion of GDP and labor as a proportion of GDP, complete divergence. And that's been manifested, for example, with the growth of globalization and free trade by industries, what Trump is trying to do at the moment, which is bring back, I heard Howard Lutnick on TV this morning say we have to bring back copper production to America. And that's the reason why they're putting a 50% tariff on copper, because they want copper manufacturing, if you can manufacture copper in America, they want to bring back. So look, one of the byproducts of globalization is industries, mature countries specialize in services, and developing countries develop manufacturing and lower cost manufacturing, like in China and beyond, and Vietnam and elsewhere, in order to be competitive on a worldwide basis. What that relies on, however, is for the developed economy to switch from manufacturing to services efficiently. And that has not happened. We have not made it easy for Detroit car workers to reskill and retrain and maybe even move to other parts of the country, and for that labor to be retrained and used again in new industries. And there have been some books written recently, I think about half a dozen books written about the inflexibility caused in America, which is much more a rental real estate market than an ownership retail market. One of the biggest problems in the UK, getting people to move, because your source of wealth was determined by your house and whether you had a house or not, and the value in the house. And if the value kept on rising, it was great. And we had ownership and people didn't move. And with the move with rentals in America being more prevalent, even in America, the owned market and the rental market wasn't sufficiently flexible for people to be able to move around the country and move from Appalachia or Detroit, from coal mining and automobiles to other industries. So we haven't provided, with the growth of the capitalist system, sufficient flexibility to provide the fluidity in jobs and job creation that were necessary. That's been our fault for doing it. So it's been too inflexible. That's created the frictions, the political frictions. I mean, Trump, has won 2 elections, both of which the results, I think, surprised people. We've been surprised here by the rise of the Reform Party and Nigel Farage. as I call him, because I think that was his name at Dulwich College. It wasn't Farage, it was Farage. The rise of Nigel and the rise of other people, populists like him. What they are symbolizing is a dissatisfaction with the economy, a dissatisfaction with the sharing of the wealth, a dissatisfaction with the spreading of that wealth, a dissatisfaction with immigration. We've got much more fluidity in the world in terms of people moving from one part of the world to the other. So immigration, as President Macron said it in his speech from, I think, to Parliament on his state visit to the UK. This is an issue that is front and centre, top of the agenda politically for both the UK and France, and it has to be dealt with. So it's a very different world, and it's a world where we have to be much more fluid in our responses. And that's an evil of the system.
In my first episode of this podcast, I was talking to my friend Michael Wolff, the biographer of Trump, who says, amongst other things, that Trump does not ever read. And he requires his briefings to be very, very short and derives most of his wisdom from watching television.
I guess the question is, watching what on television? I mean, you can watch television, there's some good stuff.
Fox and Fox followers type, what's it called, OAN and things like that. Now, the conclusion you might draw from that is that the reason Detroit car workers weren't being retrained is because Trump himself genuinely believed you could put it all back again. You could take the changes of the last 40 years of outsourcing from America and put all those lovely, well-paid, well-unionized 1950s, 1960s industrial jobs back there. Other people say that that's Canute. That's complete Canute. It can't be done. The world doesn't work that way. American costs of every kind are unsustainable for those markets. But the important thing is, whether he does it cynically or out of ignorance, it's a belief that he shares with the MAGA voters. You could bring it all back if we hadn't sent it out through globalization to those poorly paid people in countries that they'd never heard of. If you brought it all back, it would all be lovely.
Well, I don't believe. I mean, in a funny way, I think that Trump is right in one sense. One of the things we're starting to see already is AI hollow out the sort of bottom of the more menial jobs, the more humdrum jobs in manufacturing.
Yeah.
And that's already having an impact on the outsourcing that we saw happening in India. I met one of the high commissioners of India a few weeks ago, and we were discussing this, and he said it's already been seen. The outsourcers that you see, the Infosys and the Wipros of India, the TCSs of India, where we outsourced manufacturing jobs to them years ago, and they were doing them, that AI is starting to do those jobs in America, for example, and can do them more effectively. And therefore, those outsourcing operations are losing those jobs, and they're being redone in America. So in a funny way, the efficiency of manufacturing is being improved in America, but it's not producing jobs. It's just being done by bots. So I think manufacturing will become more efficient in America because of AI, but it won't result in what President Trump wants. I think high-end manufacturing, when Brookfield gets together with an Intel in Columbus, Ohio to build a chip factory or whatever it is, yes, high-end, high-performance, highly skilled manufacturing, yes, but the sort of manufacturing that he's referring to, I remember that black comedian, made the comment, we don't want to make sneakers and T-shirts and, for Nike or whatever it is in a factory. Let other people do that. We don't want to do that work. And you sort of see that in the UK. I mean, I was talking to somebody just recently who has a small manufacturing plant here in the UK, and he can't get the labour that he used to get post-Brexit because he doesn't get the European labour to come in at the levels that he wants. So I don't think that's the solution. I think what has to happen is you have to reskill the workers in the developed economies, and you have to increase the mobility of those workers to absorb the jobs or to go into the jobs that are available in a more sophisticated, more developed economy.
But that involves governments,
yes,
who are prepared to tell the electorate the truth about things, to level with them about the problems, to level with them about the fact that there are no easy solutions. The solutions being peddled by populists weren't going to work.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think that has to happen. And we see that in our own case. I mean, the government here has not leveled. I mean, they've consistently blamed the Tories, maybe rightly, for the mistakes of the last dozen or so years. They did inherit a very difficult situation, but they had time to prepare. But, they have exaggerated the position for their own purposes. And in October, the rubbers are going to hit the road. They're going to have to increase taxes. They're going to have to find more money for government spending. I mean, the other thing, Peter, that to be quite clear about, the other thing that Trump is on about, it's not just about the impact of globalization on US manufacturing. He's also very focused, quite rightly, on government spending, i.e. Doge, and he's worried about government deficits. Having said that, he's passed his big, beautiful tax bill, which is going to increase the deficit. The problem with the deficit is the electorate doesn't seem politically to be obsessed with it, or as obsessed with it as certain parts of, let's say, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Not all parts, but some of them. So that deficit issue, I referred earlier to UK spending as a proportion of GDP, the Germans being in a better position because they're at 2/3 and we're over 100%, as is the French. And we're in deep doo-doo because government spending is too high, the state sector is too big, and it has to be brought back. And that's an issue. So much of what Trump says, some of it you might like to dismiss, rightly or wrongly. Some of it, for example, the emphasis on government deficit, the emphasis on government spending, is not bad stuff, in my view. And it's stuff that we have to focus on. And there are many much brighter people than me that say we have to spend more time and more effort on it. Let me be blunt. I think we're in deep doo-doo in the UK.
Yeah.
I think Europe is in a very, very difficult position. And I think maybe with the exception of Germany, where there is, GDP growth will probably be about 2%. And the government will have difficulty because it's a coalition, but I think we'll basically be spending more, particularly on defense, and that will have a stimulative effect. But, this reminds me of 1968. I was graduating from business school in America, and it was a Wilson government, Labour government, and they had slammed up tax rates to 83% was the marginal rate, top marginal rate on earned income, and 98% on unearned income, dividend income. And I think suggesting a wealth tax that would take it to 103%, rather like Neil Kinnock suggested a couple of days ago, 2% wealth tax per annum, which I guess you'd have to sell assets to pay. It reminds me of 1968. And in 1968, the Labour government sent a guy called David Frost. He was a recruiter, not the David Frost, but a David Frost, to recruit. There were 7 of us in the graduating class at business school who were UK, and they wanted all of us to come back to the UK because there was an exodus of young people. It reminds me of what's going on in a minute, because a lot of people say a lot of wealthy people are going. Well, that's true. A lot of non-doms have gone and more are going to go. But it's not just the non-doms. In my conversations with younger people in our company, and we have sort of Gen Zers, technologically sophisticated Gen Zers who are really good people with good backgrounds, good histories, good CVs. And they're saying to me, if you were 25, 30 again, where would you be? And I have difficulty in advising them that they should be here. We're in the London bubble, you and I. Go outside London. You don't have to go far. Look at some of the things you see, and it doesn't look very pretty. And I think it's going to get tougher. I think under this government, it's going to get tougher. I'm not saying reform would be better or the Tories would be much better in their current state and condition, but we are in deep doo-doo, I think.
What could be done about it?
Well, I think my view has always been about motivation and incentive, and there isn't much of that about. This sounds like a really old man talking, so here goes. But I think COVID accelerated trends. I think work from home, work from anywhere is not necessarily a good thing. My view on this has sort of changed. I think early on during COVID, we in our own business saw a tremendous lift. We are digital natives, 7,000 of them dotted around the world. And we saw this as an opportunity. It has quickly become a bit of a liability. And I think 3-day work weeks don't work. I noticed one district council in the UK is going to a 4-day week. I think that's a disaster. I think in our business in particular, people have to be together to spark off one another, and physical proximity to one another and engagement really is pretty important. But all these trends, and this is an issue in the digital world. I heard John Stadinsky on Thought for the Day this morning on BBC as I was walking into work, and he was talking about loneliness amongst youngsters, and actually they were becoming more religious, I think was his basic point.
He's very keen on that side of life.
Yes, and that may or may not be true, but this isolation is not a good thing. And I think working together as a force is really important and will become increasingly important this area. So there are trends going on in the world socially, and COVID didn't help because it isolated people even more, made them even more reliant on social media. But bringing people together in a more effective way, it is incredibly important. But the incentives have gone out. When I see pension funds reducing their portfolio investment in equities from 50% of their portfolio to less than 5%. And one major pension fund MD, CEO said to me, I said, what does the government need to do? He's, well, reduce that stamp duty, make it more tax effective as far as the increase in equities. But frankly, I'd rather invest in a property which HMRC is going to lease, and that's a safer bet than equities. And that makes sure I've funded my pension liabilities. When I hear that, the incentives have gone out. The incentives that have made America great from an incentive and point of view. I mean, we have a wonderful education system, universities, schools need to continuously be improved. I think we have to rejig some of our university system. I think 3-year degrees, when I look at, I have children who've gone through university and grandchildren who are going through, and I look at the way they spend their time on those 3 or 4 years in university. Maybe it's not as well organized as it should be. Maybe the volume, as it's increased, the quality has declined. And maybe we have to do a very, very significant overhaul of how we educate kids at university, which I think is necessary, and how we do it. But we have a super education system, and we should capitalize on that in a digital age. We have a lot of very inventive people, but they need the incentive and the stimulus to build these businesses. And it's not just UK, it's Europe as well. I mean, I referred to Europe as a whole, and France, Italy, Spain, and the UK, I think, are in similar positions. Maybe Spain a little bit less so, but still all in the same position. Germany may be different. We still have a war going on in Europe, which we have to fix one way or the other. I mean, it just can't carry on like this in the way it is. Either we have to support Ukraine and deal with Russian aggression, or go the other way. But we have to make a decision. We can't. We see the Americans now moving from one end of the spectrum to the other. I mean, this morning, it seems as though President Trump, exasperated with Putin's lack of responsiveness, is now going to supply the Ukrainians with weapons again. So, and maybe the Russian economy is teetering on the brink and we can put pressure on the Russians. I mean, it has to be resolved one way or another. There's too much uncertainty. But coming back to the UK, we need more incentives for the private sector, both large companies and small and medium-sized companies. WPP was the largest, for what that's worth, advertising and marketing company. It is now the fourth. It's behind Publicis on any metric. It's behind Omnicom and IPG if they come together. It'll be third because two moved into one. But it's fallen from first position to third position, and that's really sad. And, this morning they issue another profit warning. The CEO is stepped down or been fired, doesn't have a CEO at the moment, is a lame duck CEO. I mean, it's a good example of where we were in a very strong position and we've now lost that position. Ironically, it's now a French company that's the most successful in the industry in the world, followed by an American, and then ourselves, and then a Japanese. So we'll see how that pans out longer term. But I think basically, Peter, we need more investment incentives, personal incentives to build wealth. I'm not talking about spending, increasing spending capacity. I'm talking about increasing investment. And we have a productivity problem in this country.
But the productivity problem there for sure, because people chose to swap cheap labour for putting capital behind workers of various kinds. That's the most economists' answer to that one. But what is our unique British problem now? People used to talk about the English disease in terms of the economy back in the day.
Look, maybe we're happier. Maybe
we could be.
Maybe we're happier. Maybe we're like the Scandinavians. Maybe we may be poorer.
But they're not poor.
Well, the number of people who come to me or we have conversation with here who say, I feel worse off than I was 5 years ago.
Yes.
And, should I be here? Should I go somewhere else? Are there better opportunities elsewhere? If I'm very frank with them, I would say, if I was 21, 23 coming out of university again, out of undergraduate, postgraduate, where would I go? Would I stay here? Not necessarily so. I might go to South America. I might go to Asia. I might go to the Middle East. I might go to the US, despite your Democratic Economist Index, even if it tightens up again next year. And there are people who are saying, for the reasons that you point out, that they don't want to go to America at this stage. So it is having an impact. I was talking to people in Canada and travel from Canada to the US as a result of the degradation of relationships with Canada and the US. Travel to the US is down quite sharply. But, having said all that, I think the incentives to be here, the opportunities to be here have to be stimulated. And it's about, coming back to the investment, it's about using the technologies that we have to improve things. The irony about what's going to happen, in my view, from an AI point of view, is that AI is going to continue to reduce labor opportunities, particularly in the more humdrum, mundane areas, and therefore retraining and reskilling is going to become critically important.
But the cultural issue seems persistent. I mean, when you say we need more incentives...
Well, it could get even worse. It could be that we have AI reducing the labor inputs. It could be that we have AI improving longevity. I mean, I remember saying to a friend of mine, we were on a trip together, and he said, Martin, thank God that you and I will be dead when AI really kicks in, because we'll be displaced. And we were talking to a futurist at a board meeting, actually in South America. It's the JP Morgan futurist. And she said, Martin, if you can hang on for another 5, 10 or 15 years, I might be able to give you another 20 or 30 because AI is going to help us. And yes. She's really interesting. She looks at venture capital investment and she looks at patent registrations to try and figure out the early waves of technological change. And longevity is one of her big focuses. And she believes, that people will be, you and I will be able to live much longer. So if you and I hang on for a few more years, Peter, we might get another 20 or 30.
But the rich will have much more access to the processes of longevity.
Well, the inference is not just the rich. The inference is that's a political point you're making there. The inference is...
Peter Thiel wants to live forever.
Yes, well, and many others too. And those who've made a fair amount of money are spending a lot of money on trying to ensure that that is the case. But the great thing about AI is this, even our government, the government's latest gimmick is the NHS app, which will solve everything. The basic point about AI is these are technologies and approaches that will benefit not just the rich, Peter, but that will benefit everybody. It will eliminate or reduce the incidence of significant disease and diseases that have plagued all the classes, not just the rich. And I think that's a huge opportunity. The downside of AI is AI in the hands of bad actors. I mean, the existential threat will remember, was it Geoffrey Hinton, who was one of the founders of DeepMind, which was sold to Google in 2014, I think, resigned from DeepMind and Google because he's worried about the existential threat. He's worried about machines becoming more powerful than people. And, we've now got people saying that we'll be able to produce with synthetic DNA robot soldiers. So there are all sorts of science fiction stories coming to roost. But my view is that AI, at the end of the day, coming back to where we started the conversation, will herald a golden era. There will be warts, there will be problems, there will be bad things done in the hands of bad actors, just like nuclear technology in the hands of bad actors can be disastrous. There will be problems, but overall, it will reduce the need for labor in various parts of the economy. It'll stimulate the need for labor in other parts. So we have to think about what we're going to do with more leisure time as well. There's all those sorts of issues to think about. If the burden on the state increases because we're living longer as well, we have to think about that in relation to deficits. All huge issues to deal with.
Back in the day, you were a teensy bit political, as Ben Elton might have said, on the subject of Brexit.
Yes.
How do you think that worked out?
Disastrously. I was against Brexit, but after Brexit, we had a shot to be Singapore on steroids or Singapore on Thames, and we blew it. Whether it was because Boris didn't have the vision or didn't get it done, whatever the reason was, we made that choice to be isolated. I think it was a mistake, but okay, that was what the electorate decided marginally, but they decided, so let's get on with it. We never did what Lee Kuan Yew did with Singapore, which different scale here, much bigger scale, probably much more difficult to do. But we never seized the opportunity. We were probably consumed with the short term or the tactics rather than thinking about the strategy. But that was a huge opportunity, but we've blown it. Now we have a Labour government, which is probably pulling us back. You see it with Macron, you'll see it increasingly pulling us back to Europe, obviously with the need to increase our defence budget from towards 5%. You won't get to 5%, but to move it up to 3 or 3.5, whatever they take it up to by whenever they do it. The need will be to synthesize and standardize. I think we produce across Europe 12 tanks. The Americans produce 1 tank, I think it is. So we have to simplify our armament production because that's going to be core to a lot of our budget and spending, not just in the UK, but in Europe as a whole. So we have to work together across Europe to deal with the Russian threat and to deal with what may happen if Putin stays in power, which it looks as though he will do.
Now, the Brexit thing, going back to it, and you were against it, but yet you saw opportunities in it which haven't been fulfilled.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that we could ever have been Singapore. It's not just the scale, it's the complexity, the historical depth of everything, the curious shape of our economy, all that stuff. And the fact that Lee Kuan Yew, wasn't it, had powers which no British government that we could conceive of now would have.
Right.
He had dictator-like powers.
Mrs. Thatcher didn't do a bad job. She was more powerful, I guess. Why was she more powerful? She had a very strong vision.
Yes.
A strong desire to implement. And she had a team of people around her who, certainly at the beginning and in the middle of the story, were not backbiting, but operated as a team. And Norman Tebbit died, a good example of it. And there was that speech of him in the House of Lords saying he regretted leaving her to her friends in the end.
Yeah.
But look, she had a strong vision. She was a strong leader. Maybe the Falklands War, for good or bad, made her as a leader to a large extent. And her vision was very much based on what I'm talking about strong incentives for people to build wealth through commitment, hard work, and dedication, through investment, not through conspicuous consumption, through investment over time. My dad used to say, find an industry you enjoy, find a company in it that you enjoy. He used to look at careers being from 20 to 60. Midpoint was 40. At the age of 40, he wanted to go and do something, hadn't built a reputation, go and do it. But he believed in long-term brand building. And I think that's something that, to some extent, maybe it's gone forever. Maybe the volatility in the economy, because of technological change primarily, but also because of the geographical fragmentation, but primarily because of technology, maybe that's shifted. Maybe long-term brand building doesn't work anymore. And maybe my dad was wrong, and maybe my philosophy is wrong as well. I mean, take WPP as an example, right? Had 30 years of success or whatever, and has now had the last 8 years has been extremely difficult. And maybe that's a function of volatility geographically and technologically. The number of people I meet now and see in various parts of the world who have done, by the time they get to 30 or 35, 3, 4, 5 things. Started an idea, sold it, built an idea, sold it on. Maybe the key skill, people talk about agility being a key skill, maybe agility and change. And, if you're living in a Trump world where literally you can be in a conference like I was, where the Canadian tariff in the morning was 25, went to 50 by midday, and was back at 25 by 4 p.m. in the afternoon. Or, wake up this morning, copper has a 50% tariff on it. Maybe in such a volatile world, long-term doesn't work anymore.
But that's hyper-individualism, isn't it? Those business school or no business school young entrepreneurs who do a bit of this, do a bit of that, create a little business and sell it at an extraordinary premium.
No, I think it's changed. I mean, I go to South America a fair bit, go at Christmas every year. And one of the things that struck me over the last 3 or 4 years, and you see a lot of people moving in. I mean, Uruguay, for example, is a tax-free or tax-me. If you live in Uruguay for 60 days a year, you can live there basically zero tax. And what you see is amazing fluidity. So, in a way, it goes back to that Trump conversation about the roots and what's happened with globalization. That's no longer the case. In a digital world, you can literally work from anywhere. The Portuguese now, again, you're giving you tax passports. You can go to Madrid. You can live in Spain. You can go and live in Milan. You can go to Israel and do a deal with the Israeli government. Cyprus, you can go virtually anywhere. And because of technology and digitization, you can do that literally from anywhere in the world. You can be rootless. This is what the government doesn't understand in relation to the non-doms. Wealth is very fluid. What's happened, large amounts of wealth have gone from the UK to Milan or to Lisbon or Madrid or Singapore or Dubai. I mean, Dubai is not to everybody's taste, but to a lot of people. I was talking to some Indian guy I had breakfast with yesterday. He said to me, it's 2.5 hours from Mumbai to Dubai. It's like going to somewhere else in India. He said, there are, I can't remember how many flights he told me there were from Mumbai to Dubai. And it was 12 flights a day.
You'll be astonished to hear I am not attracted by the prospect of removing myself to Dubai.
I don't see, but you are not the target market, Peter. And that's where I think the problem lies, is there's a huge fluidity.
For sure.
That's operating in there, and people will locate themselves, not anywhere, but their range of choices now is huge. And the investment decisions they make, the career decisions they make, the location decisions they make are very, very fluid, and governments have to understand that. And what you have to do if you're running a government is make the country attractive to that fluid It's not just capital.
Well, should you? Should you really do that?
Absolutely.
I would say that some rich people are more useful than others.
No, not rich people. I'm talking. You see, that's the problem. It's not rich people, right? The conversations I'm having are with people who are 25, 30, 35.
Yeah.
Give you one concrete example. Woman, Google, joined us, super good. I think a single mother, about 35, said to me, I'm less well off now than I was 5 years ago. If you were starting again, where would you go? And I could flannel her and tell her, you stick here. I don't think that's the right advice. This is what you've got to understand. You're not rooted anymore. You don't have a house with a mortgage around your neck.
No, I completely get that. But are you saying that people who are going to be actually young potential economic catalysts are going to move for a tax break?
Yes.
Alone.
When I worked for Mark McCormack, we handled Arnold Palmer and Gary Player and Jack Nicklaus. I remember Tony Jacklin moved to the Channel Islands and it was miserable. And we said, don't ever make a decision for where you're going to live to be based on tax. I met somebody yesterday who went to Dubai 15, 20 years ago. And he said it wasn't the place it is today. You may not like it still, but it's a very different place it is now. You're right. What you just said is right. The answer to your question is yes. If you're paying half of your income to the government, you now have the ability with technology and with the fluidity that I mentioned before, which for my dad and indeed for me is difficult to understand, to go pretty much anywhere, anytime, and locate yourself. And that's permeating everything, Peter. It's permeating immigration. You have a conflict in Sudan or Yemen or whatever, you get on a boat and you come across to the UK. So it's not just the wealthy people.
I'm going to send you a very, very funny film. It's funny in two ways. One is it's entirely constructed with AI.
Right.
No original filming was done. And it's about a group of people who see themselves as being uniquely persecuted. And it's made by the brother. You probably have come across Stephen Lambert.
Yeah. Studio
Lambert, part of All Three Media, all that stuff. Great creator of intellectual property, who's still here. This is his brother. It's about which kinds of rich people are more valuable to an economy.
Yeah.
And as for the young people, why don't you set up a research project to see what are the bases for the various decisions for the tycoons of the future in here? What's their decision-making based on? And what could we do, little English people, in order to keep them here?
Well, I think that's what we have to do. Otherwise, this place is going to be hollowed out. You're already starting to see signs of that. There are parts of the country we all know full well which are being hollowed out.
Yes, but I don't think, the bits of the country that are being hollowed out are bits of the country that are poor and don't have a very wide choice at the moment.
Yeah, but all the politics that stemmed from Boris with Rishi Sunak and now with Starmer are all because of concern about the bubbles that we see. We're fortunate enough to live in the middle of London in a bubble and work in London middle bubble. The rest of the UK is not necessarily all like that.
Not at all like that. But already, and it's a sort of 100-year process, highly talented, highly ambitious people come and try and enter our bubble first before they think about going to here, there, or everywhere. That's one of the draining things that's been happening for a very long time.
Well, I want the highest common multiple, not the lowest common denominator. That's what I'm interested in. So going back to your central question, I think the government has to think very hard about what incentives they can put together for large corporates, for middle-sized companies and small-sized companies to invest in their businesses, to create employment and to build businesses not just of the classic variety, but of the new variety as well. And we have a fantastic fabric, educational fabric, particularly university educational fabric, which should give us the grounding to do that.
So why don't you set up the Sorrell Foundation that does the definitive research about identifying early identification of those people?
Well, what is very interesting about your question is in a couple of occasions recently, one breakfast at a well-known investment bank, and then talking to somebody who runs one of the chambers of commerce, when you come down to asking people what specifics would you do in order to achieve the sort of results that we're talking about, there is a lack of response. Here are the 5 things that we'd like to see done in order to get us to nirvana.
Well, it's down to you. It's okay. Absolutely clearly down to you. And I think you could get back on a number of soapboxes about this. And God knows, we'd find a lot of people to support you in it.
Well, I can't do it after the 20% fall in the WPP share price today. It's going to be much more difficult to do that.
Well, I appreciate I see the problem, but it's a good idea, isn't it, to isolate. But as with the question of the British inability to bounce back after COVID, I want to know why so many people are not in work or education or training. Nobody's told me. I think the government ought to be telling me, or to be telling them. That should, a great but intelligent research programme should be the basis of policy about all that. But we never hear about it.
Well, it's probably a mixture of there aren't sufficient incentives and there aren't sufficient disincentives. I mean, the government spending on welfare benefits, whatever the rights and wrongs of it. I mean, when we just had a severe problem for the Starmer government, they had fiscal responsibility. Rachel Reeves trying to do her job gets knocked back by the bulk of the party or sufficient numbers of the party saying that's not something that the Labour Party stands for and we can't do. They are in power. They've made that choice. We are, in my view, going to be poorer as a result. Ultimately, somebody has to pay for this. And then you're hearing calls for wealth taxes.
I can see you're very much concerned about this one.
Yeah, very much concerned about it. Yeah, I think it's a road to nowhere.
I don't know the answer.
I want to make the cake bigger, not smaller.
Yes.
That's what I'm interested in.
I take your point, but I really don't know what constitutes incentives at different levels for the people we really want to keep here. We want to keep here the people who are the equivalent of the young you, but...
Well, on that, I go back to 1968. I was in America. The reason I came back, actually, was my mother wouldn't let me be drafted. I came back. But if there hadn't been a draft, I probably would have stayed in America. I think the situation, coming back to keeping good people here, we school the people, we educate the people, and they go. What's the point?
Yeah.
There's a whole raft of Chinese people that I know who were educated in the UK and in the US and now going back to China for 2 reasons. One is they have older parents that they want to go back and look after, so like a family reason. And the second is they want to make China great again.
Yes.
So here we are, we've got all these good people and the people like me being educated here, go to America for postgraduate, want them to come back.
Yeah.
They're not going to come back, Peter. I'm not talking about the world. I'm not talking about Brazilians or Argentinians, non-doms or Italians or French or Germans or whatever. I'm not talking about those people. Not the multi-millionaires. I'm talking about the young people. I'm talking about people who want a future, who want to work and be successful and want emotional, psychological and financial gain. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Well, we should find out all about them and what it takes, because it might be simpler than we think.
Well, I'm sure there are people in government, in the Treasury, who have been working long enough on these problems to figure out...
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But
how many civils are there? About 500,000?
Yeah.
I remember one government minister saying, you have a honeymoon period when you first get into power. It's when the Labour Party first get into power, but then the I think he said it was 350,000 civil servants to get you.
I don't know about civil servants. I don't think they're uniformly ghastly. I don't think they're
I'm sure they're not.
I don't think they're uniformly delaying or any of those things. I'd rather be on the subservient ratio count. I'd rather be here than Rwanda, put it like that.
I'm sure they're super good.
Thank you very, very much indeed.
I hope that was a help.
It was a great help. And I'll be back to you with a big proposal for a foundation.
I wondered what the purpose of this was.
That's it. Foundation.
Thanks very much, Peter.
Thank you. Many thanks to Sir Martin Sorrell. Next time on Culture Wars House Party, I'll be talking to Catherine Stewart, the brilliant journalist and author who's been tracking the rise of the religious right as a political force in America, and she's been doing it with unnerving precision. Culture Wars House Party is presented by me, Peter York, and it's produced by Kate Dixon at Good Egg Productions. Do listen in again. Goodbye.